CMV, people who have been wrongfully imprisoned should automatically be compensated for their time in prison to such an extent that they can live a comfortable lifestyle. The main focus of my stance is people who have served long sentences for serious crimes such as those wrongfully convicted of murder or rape and released decades after their conviction, although I would also support some form of compensation for lesser sentences for lesser crimes. But the main focus of this CMV should be those convicted of major crimes such as murder who have spent many years in prison before their release. One concept we have in American justice is the idea that someone who is sent to prison is paying their debt to society. The premise behind this is that a crime causes harm to society to a whole, and having the criminal give up his or her quality of life for some time balance the scales. If said person faced the same punishment without having owned that debt, then the reverse must be true, society owes them a debt. Since it is impossible to give them extra years on their life, the next best thing is to make the remaining years they have left as good as possible, and financial compensation is the best way to do that. The job market can be hard enough for anyone, let alone someone with a huge gap in their employment history. Even if it is understood that the conviction was reversed, there may be some employers who may be prejudiced against that person. Maybe they feel that it's possible that they actually were guilty and don't want to hire them. Even without such prejudice, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which a person with 15 years of experience would not get a job over someone who had 15 years of no job experience because they were in prison, save for an employer wanting to be charitable. Finally, there is the concept of time away from life. Think about the things that you enjoy that make life worth living. Whether that be time with friends, family, traveling, going to concerts, or simply taking a walk outside, imagine having years taken from your life where you couldn't do these things. Most people spend a large portion of their waking hours working to sustain a lifestyle of these things in their free time. I spend time away from my wife at work, so that the time I do get to spend with her after work and on weekends is enjoyable, and that we have necessities such as food and shelter. Someone who has been wrongfully imprisoned shouldn't have to spend their time doing anything other than trying to make up for lost time. They should be able to spend every day with their family and friends and just relaxing, doing things most of us hope to do in retirement. But maybe there's something I missed. If you feel differently, see if you can change my view. While a commendable view, this creates an issue of perverse incentives. As it stands, the justice system is encouraged to incarcerate the guilty and release the innocent. If an error is found and can be proved in court, it is in the interest of the state to release the innocent. Jailing someone costs $. However, by compensating released individuals, you have created a reason for the state to not release innocent individuals. It may well be in the state's financial interest to keep them incarcerated rather than pay your proposed fee. This results in DAs fighting to keep innocent people in jail rather than incentivizing DAs to release people who are innocent. Edit: given the large number of responses to this, I will try to respond here, rather than to you all individually. There is more to life than economic incentives. There are moral incentives, there are social incentives, there are psychological needs, etc. The point I was originally attempting to make goes something like this. Governments run smoothly when moral incentives and economic incentives align. Currently, moral incentives and economic incentives are aligned. Incarcerating the guilty and releasing the innocent makes sense both morally and economically. Yes, there are personal incentives such as, that case really make my career, therefore I personally don't want to reverse my position, so the current system isn't perfect, but at least the moral and economic incentives were aligned, even if occasional personal incentives did not. Introducing OP's proposed payment changes this. Now the moral incentive to incarcerate the guilty and release the innocent is opposed by the economic incentive to not release anyone once they are incarcerated, guilty or not. This isn't to say all court officials have no heart and wouldn't follow the moral road, but things do tend to run much more smoothly when moral incentives and economic incentives align rather than collide. I've heard people mention payments approximately equal the cost in incarcerating. This produces skew incentives, moral incentives which aren't linked to economic incentives. Skew incentives are better than opposing incentives, but aligned incentives are better than skew incentives. Therefore, it is better to leave things as they are rather than introduce OP's proposed payments. Or phrased much shorter, people follow the money, people also tend to be moral. When the moral thing is also the economic thing, there tends to be high compliance. When the moral thing and the economic thing counteract, people are less likely to do the moral thing relative to when the moral thing and the economic thing coincided. This isn't to say that people aren't moral, but acknowledges it is easier to do the moral thing when it is also in your economic interest to do so, relative to when doing the moral thing is economically costly. Velta. This is a point I haven't thought about, and a scary one at that. It reminds me of the beginning of the film and book Fight Club, where the narrator, Edward Norton, talks about how his job entails analyzing the cost of a product recall versus the cost of paying out lawsuits for defective products, and if the recall is more expensive then the product stays in circulation despite being dangerous if not deadly. This is scary, especially considering that the government would be in charge of paying the bill for the wrongfully convicted and also in charge of deciding whether or not to release the wrongfully convicted and be forced to pay money. While I wish there were a way to ensure that the wrong people wouldn't be put in prison, and if they were they could at least retire early and try to enjoy what time they had left, if the options were to keep someone innocent in prison or free them without compensation, the latter is still better. The scenario you put forth reminded me of making a murderer, and whether or not you believe Steve Avery was wrongfully convicted of murder, there does seem to be strong evidence that the prosecution went to extreme measures to ensure his conviction. So while I won't go so far as to say you have completely changed my view, I have definitely won from a black and white view of the issue to more of a gray area.
Holy shit, dude, I never thought about it that way.
Increment well earned for you. It still really sucks for someone to have years or even decades of their lives taken away and not receiving a penny in compensation. However, without such compensation, it is likely that more innocent people will be exonerated since the state no longer has incentive to keep them imprisoned. The bad outweighs the good, I guess. This is sort of the whole point in creating divisional separation that you can get with a government and not a private entity. The DA's job is not to make money for the state. Her goals, quotas, expectations, reviews, etc. are not driven by money, nor should they ever be. If they were, the DA would be encouraged to refuse to press charges on low-recidivism risk criminals. The cheapest solution for an extreme case spouse killer, like a wife who kills her abuser in cold blood, is a severe probation and preventing her from having a romantic relationship. It's definitely cheaper than life imprisonment and provides incentives/disincentives relatively ideal to most governments and the bottom line. But it's the DA's job to put the guilty in jail and let the innocent free. A DA rarely is, because of our tough-on-crime mindset, get in a lot of trouble if they push for a plea deal before discovery and they're hiding exonerating evidence. They often continue to argue and fight when a conviction is overturned due to exoneration. Thing is, exoneration is not supposed to be the DA's job. Nor is the cheapest option. Of course, there's a legitimate problem here. There's not a very controlled mechanism for exoneration. There's some precedents that proven innocence is a valid appeal in death row cases, but there are non-death row cases going on now I think now. From Googling where people who were convicted of crimes now claim to have concrete evidence of innocence, and prosecution is appealing on the question of whether innocence is a valid reason for appeal. Like here, http://legalnews.com/Detroit/1455261. So I guess the DAs are already fighting to keep innocent people in jail. They're fighting tooth and nail. Don't ask me why. What is a relatively comfortable? You can't buy all the people who look at you as prison garbage. Turn you down for a job because of a background check. You can't buy back years of missed birthdays, sporting events, anniversaries, marriage, having children, watching kids grow up, going to your own mother's funeral. Sitting in a jail cell year after year. Getting beat up or worse in jail. Seeing life pass you by on the other side of a fenced-in prison yard. Some things just can't be bought with money. I completely agree that no amount of money will fully recompense someone who has had years of their life taken from them. Personally, I'm 33 years old. If I were wrongfully put in prison and released after 20 years, I would have missed out on the prime of my life. My wife and I would have missed out on the opportunity to have kids, my parents would be elderly if they were still alive at all, and my older relatives would certainly be dead. And all of that is notwithstanding a lot of the abuses you mentioned that people do in fact face in prison. That being said, attempting to make life outside of prison and the years someone has left as comfortable as possible is a better alternative than doing nothing. In my scenario, nothing could bring back my youth, my parents, or any of that, but to say okay, you're free but you'll never get to retire and you'll have to spend most of your waking hours trying to scrape by a measly living would just make things even worse. It wouldn't completely fix things, but it would be better to be able to say, I missed out on my youth, but now I'm retired and can devote every waking minute to the things and people I missed while I was gone.